Hi, everybody, class and other people. Welcome. Welcome to the third in our wonderful series, Issues in Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Quick reminder, central launch next week. Register if you haven't already. I can't tell you exactly that there's an open bar, but there's an open bar. So you should feel free to come. Yes, that's all I have to say about that, really. You should register online at the Center for Global Law and Justice website. There also will be food and non-alcoholic beverages. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Vasuki Nesiah here today for her talk, Victim, Gender as Tool and Weapon. Professor Nesiah teaches human rights, legal, and social theory at New York University Galatin School, where she's also faculty director of the Galatin Global Fellowship in Human Rights. She has published quite widely on the history and politics of human rights, humanitarianism, international criminal law, reparations, global feminisms, and decolonization. She was awarded the Galatin Distinguished Teacher Award in 2021, as well as the NYU Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Faculty Award in 2020. She has just published the book from which her talk today will be drawn, International Conflict Feminism. There's a copy right there you can see. And also has another forthcoming book, Reading the Ruins, Colonialism, Slavery, and International Law. She was a founding member of Third World Approaches to International Law, or TWAIL, which my students will have heard a great deal about, and is co-editing right now TWAIL, a handbook, with a number of the other founders and major people in that area. And worth saying, because I think it very much informs her talk and this book, is that she spent many years as a human rights lawyer working on law and policy in the field of post-conflict justice at the International Center for Transitional Justice before coming into full-time academia. And while she was there, she founded and headed the ICTJ's gender program and served as senior associate, leading their work in a number of countries, including South Africa, India, Ghana, Nepal, and the Philippines. So we're very excited to host her here at Northeastern today. I am also truly delighted to welcome as our respondent today my colleague from International Affairs, Professor Jelena Golubovic, how did I do? Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology and International Affairs, who also has many wonderful and amazing accomplishments, but I want to just mention that she has a forthcoming book, Inner Zone, The Untold Violence of Retribution in Besieged Sarajevo, which I will say I'm personally extremely excited to read. So as always, our speaker will have about 30 to 40 minutes to speak, and our respondent about 10 or 15 to respond. And then I will open it up to question and answer from everybody, including those who are joining on Zoom. You should feel free to put a question into the chat or to raise your hand on Zoom during that period of time. So with that, let us welcome Professor Nesiah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Zina, for inviting me, and Jelena, very nice to just meet you, and generously reading and responding to the piece, and actually respondents from the class as well, which and I've begun to read those responses as well. So thank you very much. And I don't know whether Stephen Evans is here, but please convey my thanks to him because he did all these arrangements, and I'm just terrible on email, and he would send emails and I would respond zillions of days later, and he would be very tolerant, and so thank you wherever it may be possible. And I'm really happy to speak about the book. It's officially out and launched just in California last week, so this is like its second time sort of going out of the house by coming up to Boston. So yes, very, very, very happy to be here to speak about it. In 2021, 20 years after America invaded Afghanistan, President Joe Biden ordered the US military to pull out of Afghanistan. The American intelligentsia saw the West as safeguarding women's interests during the occupation and lamented the fate of Afghan women in the Taliban-controlled landscape. It was a harsh new reality for Afghan women and girls, the New York Times declared. This was a harsh reality, but the idea that it was a harsh new reality is curious. The American invasion resulted in the deaths of over 250,000 Afghans and Pakistanis. In addition, the Brown University Cost of Wars project documents enormously adverse impacts on malnutrition, health, and many dimensions of the everyday life of Afghan women and girls under US occupation. However, much of the liberal punditry bemoaned the American pullout as if the US military was not the most powerful imperial war machine the world has ever seen, but a benevolent champion of girls' education and feminist agendas. This was one take on the pullout. In contrast, at the same time, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, the oldest Afghan women's organization, also released a statement on that inauspicious 20th anniversary. RAWA condemned what it described as the odious Taliban regime. However, they also celebrated the departure of the US, saying that the departure would pave the way for the establishment of a new justice-seeking movement that would fight against fundamentalists and imperialists. This was another take. The divergence of these two contrasting prognoses of the possibilities and risks that were pregnant in that moment speak to the central drivers of this book. This book tells the story of the astonishing uptake of what I term international conflict feminism in the most powerful institutions of global governance. In this preliminary remarks, let me just give you a thumbnail sketch of what I'm talking about when I speak about international conflict feminism. ICF, or ICF as I refer to it from here on. ICF's policy commitments take as their starting point two notions. Firstly, that women are victimized by conflict, and secondly, that women are excluded or marginalized in peace and security decision-making and post-conflict recovery. Seeking to remedy both these issues, ICF has prioritized legal accountability for women's victimization and intervention directed at the inclusion and empowerment of women in conflict and post-conflict contexts. This agenda organically integrated with the institutions of the post-Cold War world order, when conflict zones became the shock doctrine portal to a transformation of the global governance architecture. Rising from the ashes of the Cold War, the winds of a triumphant liberalism moved to remake the world. With those winds at its back, ICF was forged in the early 1990s in feminist responses to the war in the former Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. The unprecedented uptake of feminist ideas in institutions and processes of global governance is the ICF story. First, however, I want to tell you a little bit about the ecosystem that gave rise to ICF. Security Council resolution passed the resolution 3025 on women, peace and security in 2000. Security Council resolution 3025 or 3025 as I call it calls for integrating women and a gender perspective into all aspects of how the UN and member states approach peace and security issues. This extends from protecting women and girls from conflict-related sexual violence to ensuring women's full and equal participation in all dimensions of conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction. 3025 was widely celebrated when it was passed, yet even then few realized the extent to which it would open the door to an extraordinary era of Security Council engagement in the name of feminism. Feminists mobilized with governments, international organizations, and civil society bodies to undertake a host of new initiatives following the Security Council's actions. These have extended from coordinated national action plans by more than 100 states to thousands of grassroots workshops on 3025 by community-based organizations all over the world. In the 2015 UN Global Study reviewing 3025's first 15 years, Radhika Kumarasamy notes that of the more than 2,200 resolutions adopted by the Security Council in its whole lifetime, in its 7 decades of history, it is hard to think of one resolution that is better known for its name, number, and content than Resolution 3025. 10 resolutions to date have followed 3025 to affirm and extend its mandate in the realm of women, peace, and security. These resolutions are a response to women's experience in context of war and post-conflict peace. The emergence and momentum of ICF have a kinship with two other historical processes of the post-Cold War period. One is a concerted focus on violence against women, and the other is a story about global governance, namely the discursive construction of a conflict zone that warrants intervention. Given the constraints of time, I'm not going to elaborate on violence against women at this point. I know that many of you also read this chapter, so you have a sense of where I'm going. But I want to pause with the notion of conflict zones and the milieu that shaped their contours in the 1990s, and in particular to the battlefields of the former Yugoslavia, when NATO took the extraordinary action of bombing Belgrade. There was no Security Council authorization for this action, and critics such as the feminist organization Women in Black decried this illegal military intervention. Bill Clinton and other defenders of NATO's actions argued that a conflict zone called for different rules. It was not politics as usual. Political society had been replaced by humanitarian crisis. An urgent need for action had rendered moot the niceties of formal authorizations, they said. An international commission convened to assess NATO's actions issued the Kosovo report declaring the 1999 NATO intervention illegal but legitimate. This moment and this conclusion was an indicator that a particular notion of a conflict zone was becoming consolidated as a new form of terra nullius that could be acted upon by powerful outside actors with different norms and expectations. Terra nullius was a myth of an unpeopled land that was invoked explicitly or implicitly in the doctrine of discovery to dispossess indigenous people and colonize their land, including, of course, the United States, or what we now know as the United States. The notion of a conflict zone as a terra nullius of this contemporary imperial moment was reinvigorated during the war in the former Yugoslavia through the law and policy framework of humanitarian intervention, while carrying the legacies of colonial tropes about places and spaces that were rescued through Western intervention. Channeling the euphoria of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, Francis Fukuyama's End of History famously pronounced in 1992 that the world would soon witness the universalization of Western liberal democracy as a final form of human government. The post-ideology world that Fukuyama rhapsodized about was, of course, neither post-ideological nor post-racist. Samuel Huntington, Fukuyama's former professor, responded to Fukuyama in 1996 with the racist great clash of civilizations, a battle cry for the West over the rest in the post-Cold War culture wars. Concerned that Fukuyama's thesis was conflict averse, Huntington urged the West to accept their civilization as unique but not universal, and to unite to renew and preserve it against challenges from non-Western societies. Unless we hate what we are not, he wrote, we cannot love what we are. The civilizational animus of Huntington and the liberal utopianism of Fukuyama converge in the discursive construction of the conflict zone as a failed illiberal state that calls for rescue and rehabilitation through intervention from the global north. Intervention that can be legitimate even if illegal. There is no better example of ICF mobilizing in these terms than the feminist arguments advanced in support of intervention in Afghanistan. Perhaps the archetypical conflict zone within the dominant conflict zone lexicon. In a recent article, Ratna Kapoor calls it the first feminist war in all history. And that seems especially apt because if Afghanistan is archetypical conflict zone, the US invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was the archetypical ICF war, where groups like the Feminist Majority Foundation and individuals like Laura Bush leaned into war in the name of feminism. If the road rules of the 1990s mapped conflict zones as requiring external intervention, intervention itself got reframed and redeemed not as a right to intervene, but as a responsibility to protect, a term that is now a Security Council and General Assembly authorized policy framing for humanitarian intervention. The drumbeat of Samuel Huntington's battle cry continued to reverberate in the foreign policy corridors of the West in ways that merged Western liberal democracy promotion agendas with humanitarian intervention agendas as a Security Council legitimized calling card of interventionists. The subjects of this discourse justifying humanitarian intervention in terms of Western liberal political values married a discourse of failed states to a discourse of good governance. As I elaborate in the book, figures such as Anne Slaughter and Hillary Clinton rebrand the Fukuyama-Huntington framing in positing liberal statecraft as intertwined with feminist agency and empowerment in ways that get deployed in liberalism's post-Cold War culture wars. The milieu represented by Fukuyama, Huntington, Slaughter, and the Clintons give rise to a militant liberalism and a militant Orientalism that converged in the post-Cold War era of international humanitarian intervention. From Afghanistan to Iraq, the ICF brand of feminism has played a central role in the production of legitimacy in those terms. In the past 3 decades, ICF has ascended the summits of global governance as a remarkably successful participant in the post-Cold War law and policy infrastructure. Borrowing a Bavarian formulation, one could say that ICF agendas and priorities can be seen to have an elective affinity with the institutions of global governance and larger processes forging the dominant world order. Accordingly, the ICF vision of feminism has become the normative common sense understanding of gender in conflict and post-conflict environments, and this normative common sense inflects a force field of synergies between ICF and the apparatus of global governance. Today, the most powerful countries of the world describe their military, economic, and policy interventions as a feminist foreign policy. The task of understanding, assessing, and parochializing the feminism that walks the halls of global governance becomes especially urgent in that context. This book is both a testament to ICF's success within hegemonic institutions of global governance, as well as a critical analysis of how these successes were intertwined with the defeat of visions and agendas that challenged those institutions. Marking ICF's achievements also entails assessing those achievements' costs and consequences, intended and unintended, including the alternative feminist ideas, agendas, and movements that were eclipsed as ICF gained traction. The diverse range of non-ICF feminist traditions referenced include anti-imperial and anti-racist, decolonial, anarchist, and leftist feminisms, and the projects that were associated with their different historical moments. Each chapter in the book pauses at different sites in the international governance architecture of conflict zones, including the very construction of that category, the conflict zone. So the different spots where it pauses include the UN peacebuilding processes, Security Council, International Criminal Court, Truth Commissions, the field of transitional justice, the World Bank, and post-conflict economic policy. I conclude in Chapter 7 with a discussion of both ICF's co-travelers as well as dissident or alternative feminisms. I thought what I might do today is tell you a little bit about Chapter 4, again, which I think some of you have read. The title of this talk draws from that chapter, although I've spent most of my time thus far talking about the arc of the book, since some of the students in the room have read that chapter. It is a chapter that speaks of the International Criminal Court by way of a case that came before it, the El Hassan case, emerging from the ICC's engagement in the West African country of Mali. In January 2013, citizens of Kona and Diablé in central Mali in West Africa found themselves being bombarded by French airstrikes in the name of counterterrorism. Termed Operation Sawal in French military speak, François Hollande described the military operation as support for Malian troops in confronting terrorism. As you know, Mali was formerly a French colony, and this is part of the long backstory to those airstrikes. More immediately, Operation Sawal has both a regional backstory linking military escalation of CVA activities in Libya and other parts of the Sahel, and a global backstory where there has been an ongoing escalation of military, cultural, and legal interventions linking Islam to violent extremism in Mali, France, and elsewhere in Europe and America. Mali became, in fact, the 7th Muslim majority country where Security Council members and their allies had launched a military attack in 4 years. This particular chapter was interested in how international criminal law gets invoked in military operations, such as the French airstrikes in Mali 10 years ago. In a familiar sequence, the planes carrying bombs were soon followed by planes carrying emissaries from the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. The ICC launched an investigation into the situation in Mali that same month with their attention trained on the same targets as France's Operation Sawal. These investigations gave rise to a much celebrated case against Mr. Al-Hassan Mahmoud of Timbuktu, Mali, for a range of crimes, including religious persecution and gender persecution. The focus was on actions undertaken in his role as chief of the Islamic police and member of Ansar Dine, an insurgent paramilitary group in northern Mali. The ICC issued a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Al-Hassan in March 2018. He surrendered in a matter of days, and the trial has been unfolding in The Hague since July 2020 and was just concluded. Both parties made closing statements in May of that year. The statute of the ICC inaugurated the codification of gender-based persecution as a crime, and this case is the first substantive interpretation and application of these provisions. Feminist groups immediately voiced support for the ICC's case against Al-Hassan and applauded the ICC's charge sheet as groundbreaking. Striking the gender-based persecution charges have traveled only as companions to contexts where religious-based persecution charges are co-travelers, and thus far only where that religion is Islam. This becomes increasingly important in situating the slippage between Islam and violent extremism in much of the related feminist commentary on persecution charges. My book does not deal with Mr. Hassan's guilt or innocence. Rather, my interest in this case inheres in what it tells us about contemporary feminist politics in the international public sphere, including its relationship to hegemonic approaches to counterterrorism and Islamophobia. This chapter is devoted to understanding how this case came about, what were the broader dynamics, the ideational structure, the institutions of global governance that form the backstory to the Al-Hassan case. In that context, I have 6 interlocking preoccupations. First and foremost, the chapter probes how this case became thinkable through synergies between 3 converging force fields that are part of its backstory. Firstly, counterterrorism, 2, lawfare and the role of the ICC, and thirdly, international conflict feminism. The persecution of Al-Hassan on charges of gender and religious persecution is a grain of sand through which we understand the universe of mutually reinforcing desires and revulsions that propel these force fields. Desire, we may say, for law and war, and revulsions about Islam and sex. This psychopolitical habitus has become normalized as part of the infrastructure of global governance. A second theme pertains to the continuities and discontinuities between everyday Islamophobia as it reveals itself in domestic politics regarding the rail ban of forced marriage and Sharia hysteria, etc., and geopolitics, the Islamophobia that drives the military offensive of the West in primarily Islamic countries. So I want to link the everyday to the global geopolitical in some sense. A third theme is that one dimension of lawfare today is not just the mobilization of law as an instrument of war, but that lawfare presents itself as a battle between liberal legalism and alternative legal systems. And again, in particular, legal systems that are Islamic and render the system of criminality rather than legality through this dichotomy. A fourth theme is about the ICC and the argument that if in its first phase on the world stage, it was characterized by an overwhelming focus on African countries and the charges of racism in its prosecutorial priorities, in its second phase seems to be characterized by an overwhelming focus on Muslim-majority countries, including those in Africa, such as Libya and Mali. A fifth theme is about how the term intersectionality has been appropriated and flipped as part of a technology of governance. In the history of critical race theory, intersectionality was an important vantage point for vulnerable groups to hold powerful actors accountable. Accordingly, the vantage point was a bottom-up, heterodox feminist perspective aimed at better illuminating the nature of oppression. With intersectionality being employed by NATO's CVE campaign, the Countering Violent Extremism campaign, allied ICC for a prosecutorial vantage point, it raises questions about what gets illuminated and what gets obscured from this sort of top-down perspective. And this is a striking turn for intersectionality analysis. And finally, a sixth theme is about how these interventions sidestep the diversity of local feminist perspectives. Malian women have a long tradition of political activism, but their sheer diversity complicates the idea of women's interests. For instance, the late Major Mom Diarra, probably brutalizing her name, argued that the most prominent UN conference on women in the 1990s, that is the 1995 Beijing conference, where Clinton famously made her women's rights a human rights speech, that in that, Diarra speaks about that conference, she was also present there, and the feminism that it gave voice to, it did not speak to her local realities and Malian women's agendas for sustainable economic development. Diarra too is speaking about how gender intersects with other social forces, but the local reality she is foregrounding here is not Islam, but the injustices that structure Malian women's economic circumstances. The forms of feminist universalisms represented by Beijing or ICF neglects how a sole focus on gender denies the differences and injustices, economic and otherwise, that determine feminist agendas in Mali. In summary, this chapter analyzes the convergence of religion and gender-based persecution charges to raise questions about how women's rights discourse and feminist projects become conscripted into colonial, racialized, Islamophobic tropes and legacies regarding rights in and against culture, to connect the dots between battlefields and courtrooms, judges and generals. Focusing on the international conflict, feminism, counterterrorism and lawfare nexus throws into relief the profoundly troubling drivers that have birthed cases like Al-Hassan and raise questions about feminist entanglements. This chapter read the Al-Hassan case at the ICC as a grain of sand through which we can examine the universe at the crossroads of Sharia panic, sex panic, and security panic. Well, that was a little window into one of the chapters. So let me now conclude by returning to ICF as a historical project. I began my remarks today by speaking of the contrasting responses to the American military pullout from Afghanistan by voices grounded in American feminism and voices grounded in African feminism. The post-Cold War global governance ecosystem that helped birth ICF and shaped its trajectory illuminates what ICF includes and what it excludes. For instance, a passionate women's rights discourse has accompanied American bombs and drones in Afghanistan, but anti-imperial feminism has not been part of the ICF Afghanistan story. The American liberal intelligentsia's framing of the American military presence in Afghanistan as an anchor for women's rights agenda is both an expression of ICF and a window into the larger milieu that ICF inhabits. ICF is a transnational project and feminists from different parts of the world have contributed to it. However, it is the global north that has been the home of its most prominent feminist politicians, such as the German Foreign Affairs Minister Annalena Baerbock, who is the author of the Feminist Foreign Policy Framework, and its most influential feminist networks, such as the Canada-based Coalition on Women's Human Rights in Conflict Situations. The EU and countries like Canada and Australia have been important funders of ICF projects and have helped open the doors of multilateral agencies to ICF frameworks. Most significantly, however, is American feminists who have had an outsized role in ICF, and some of the feminist ideas discussed in this book become increasingly mainstreamed into US law and policy in the very same moment that they gain traction with institutions like the Security Council and the World Bank. In particular, I identified two kindred agendas and co-travelers. that rendered the North American feminist policy habitus an especially fertile territory for the emergence of ICF in the 1990s, namely neoliberal feminism and carceral feminism. These kindred projects are part of a very American story and a window into the arc of second wave feminism in the US. By virtue of being co-travelers refracting some of the zeitgeist of the moment, these different feminist projects amassed a certain synergistic force and help us understand how certain ICF orientations came to seem commonsensical. For instance, carceral feminist logics of accountability and victims' rights help us understand ICF's turn to ICL and prosecutions. Bill Clinton signed the Violence Against Women's Act in 1994, at the same time that there began to be a marked turn towards criminal law in the international sphere. Notably, the ICTY and ICTR and ICC were all established in an overlapping 5-year period from 1993 to 1998. This era was key to feminist legal networks developing a foundation for strategic engagement with these institutions and the development of an ICF approach to criminal prosecutions of sexual violence and conflict. Similarly, the emergence of neoliberal feminism within the US helped seed the ground for the ICF turn to women's entrepreneurship as economic empowerment in post-conflict recovery. It's not a section that you read, but chapter 6 of the book speaks particularly as a very marked turn to the economic. The Clinton administration's 1996 welfare reform bill's attack on poor women's welfare entitlements ran parallel to the structural adjustment program slashing national budgets across the globe. In the Washington Consensus had both the domestic and an international face. ICF helps connect the dots between the story of American empire and the American feminist projects of neoliberal and carceral feminism. One of the shared dimensions of ICF in all of these contexts is policy positions and jurisprudential arguments that discount, ignore, or exacerbate the power relations that are embedded in institutions of global governance and their distributive consequences. In this sense, we might see ICF as a form of imperial feminism, whose face has been constituted by and in turn contributes to racial capitalist power relations. Historically, imperial feminisms have contributed to the material infrastructure of empire by contributing directly to the work of imperial expansion and exploitation, or by doing ideological work that legitimizes empire in advancing a model of normative womanhood that regulates and governs. Race is a central dimension of the co-constitutive dialectic between the material infrastructure of imperial feminism and its ideological ground. However, capturing how race travels when American feminist projects go international is challenging. On the one hand, the meanings and trajectories of race and racism have a historical specificity and they constitute differently in every context. Many dimensions of the racial politics of carceral feminism are very specific to American slave history and the prison industrial complex in the United States. On the other hand, the American history of race also has international reach. The history of American empire is also a history of links between American militarism and American policing, democracy and empire, and racial oppressions nationally and internationally. For instance, there are suggestive parallels between the overwhelming prosecutorial focus on black men as part of the domestic dynamic of carceral feminism and the overwhelming focus on men from Africa and Muslim-majority countries as part of the international dynamic of ICF. These fraught racial histories have shaped how the ICF project has unfolded. Guy Spivak's line about interventions aimed at saving brown women from brown men conveyed the ways in which the civilizational burden of the colonizer lives on today in the figure of the third world woman. The racialized tropes of gendered Orientalism have long been a companion of empire, and women from imperial centers have long participated in colonization, often in the name of women's rights. Analysis of these lines of synergy and influence help us better understand the related trajectories of domestic racism and imperialism. At the same time, there is profit in attending to their distinct rivals and distinct priorities. For instance, carceral feminism has shared prioritization of criminal law with ICF, but its investment in prosecutorial strategy is much more focused on the American prison industrial complex, while ICF's ICL investments need to be understood in terms of humanitarian intervention and its imperial logics. Carceral feminism is a dimension of the afterlives of slavery and anti-blackness in the US, while ICF is also a dimension of the afterlives of colonialism and Islamophobia. Valerie Amos and Pratibha Parma argue that one telling dimension of imperial feminism is its effort to colonize the domain of feminism itself, arguing that the task here is to begin to identify the ways in which a particular tradition, white, Eurocentric, and Western, has sought to establish itself as the only legitimate feminism. The US global feedback loop is such that the current moment of reckoning for American carceral feminism and neoliberal feminism will have repercussions globally. For instance, writing about abolition as a feminist project, Angela Davis advocates for what she calls an older notion of feminist internationalism, where American feminists can learn from and collaborate with struggles elsewhere, Brazil, South Africa, Palestine. A testament, she says, to feminist collectives all over the world that have engaged in all kinds of incredibly creative projects and assist us as we try to move forward here in the United States. In this spirit, after hostile rulings from the US Supreme Court, some American feminist groups have joined Redstone's Frontiers to get training and support from Mexican feminists on how to navigate a shrinking reproductive rights space and strategizable approaches going forward. Reversing the directionality of global north, global south paths for information and collaboration. In January 2022, more than 30 Mexican and American abortion rights groups met for the former to train the latter on issues that range from accessing and using abortion pills to working with WHO guidelines on reproductive medicine. These developments may well portend a revival of more solidaristic, anti-imperial traditions of feminist internationalism, with greater openness to critical debate as we move forward. It may also portend a greater openness to learning from spaces and places of subversion and unsettling. Thus, in closing, finally closing really, this time, let me draw from the initially illuminating observations of Laila Ulrich on the ICC. She analyzes the ICC's victim outreach meetings in Uganda and Kenya. These are conflict zones in Uganda and Mexico. After much pressure, the ICC now regularly convenes these meetings to inform the community of proceedings and its own procedures. These workshops function or are intended to function as an institutional channel schooling these communities into the ICL script regarding the rule of law and the subject positions of victims and perpetrators, local atrocity and international justice. Producing legitimacy for the work of the court is also about producing victim subjects on whose behalf the court does its work. The Ugandan and Kenyan participants at these meetings were never quite as attentive at these meetings as the ICC would have liked. Ulrich studies these meetings, and this is what she's tracking. In fact, they often forget what was transmitted at a previous meeting, and when they are present, they are perennially distracted from the meeting proceedings by their children who they brought with them, by arrangements they're making for their transportation, from this meeting, various other uninvited people they brought to the meetings. There's both an immediate material reward from participation because of the ICC's transportation, attendance, and answers, as well as a more uncertain profit in complying with this globally powerful entity which may or may not provide a path to reparations or other kinds of benefits. Ulrich observes all these proceedings, and her analysis reads the intrusions of these women's sort of quotidian life responsibilities and concerns into court's operations as a hidden transcript of resistance vis-à-vis the ICC, as well as the global governance landscape in which it is embedded. James Scott, the political theorist, invokes the notion of a hidden transcript to speak of how apparent public compliance by the dominated can travel alongside hidden transcripts of resistance. Indeed, that this may be core to the art of subaltern resistance. Ulrich describes the genres of resistance that emerge in the ICC outreach meetings as performing both participation and disavowal. She reads this mode of resistance, fused participation, as embedded in gendered economies of social reproduction that stand in contrast and challenge to circuits of global capital, colonial and post-colonial. Ulrich describes the part of Uganda where these outreach events take place as not only landscapes of war and war crimes, but also landscapes that are being pulled into circuits of global capital, and the crimes of dispossession that are embedded in those circuits. Yet significantly, these are pockets of non-capitalist domains in this capitalism-dominated mixed economy, and these pockets include women's access to communal land. That access is central to Ulrich's analysis of the enabling conditions. Concomitantly, their mode of resistance is anchored in the relationships and dynamics of social reproduction. Thus, even the forms of resistance that Ulrich draws attention to are unorganized and deeply embedded in the life force that sustains these women. Their resistance is not a complete refusal of the code, but it is a renegotiation of the subject positions to which the victim outreach schooling seeks to interpolate them. And it is a renegotiation that frustrates and interrupts a code script for victimhood. Ultimately, the hidden transcripts of resistance that Ulrich foregrounds is also an argument that the work of the code cannot be insulated from the ICC outreach workshop participants on how they grapple with the socioeconomic conditions of their lives. Indeed, in resisting the code's scripts for them, they are also resisting the code's attempt at such insulation. I spoke earlier about the regulative role of the category of the conflict zone in international law and policy. The resistance of the outreach meeting participants is a resistance of the whole premise of the ICC's mandate treatment of the atrocities of war as occupying a zone of exceptionality that is material removed from the atrocities of everyday precarity. As Swati Pasha observes, people live inside the death, destruction, and survival of war, but they do so in ways that are intimately tied to how they live inside the death, destruction, and survival of the everyday. The dissident feminisms and conflict zones that I have engaged with here are contesting different dimensions of the logics of war in different places, be it international institutions or institutions of the state, circuits of capital or the circulation of nationalism, the distributive consequences of these logics and their legitimating ideologies. In addition, they're also challenging how the conflict zone gets mobilized as a form of global governance. In the ICC outreach meetings in informal and contingent ways, the density of participants' lives and responsibilities unders the notion of a conflict zone that disconnects the atrocities of war that are subject to ICC prosecutions and the atrocities they're negotiating in their everyday life under late capitalism. It is in effect to challenge the distinction between the extraordinary violence that begets war crimes and the slow violence that is not a crime in the eyes of the prevailing global governance regimes. The complex plurality of agendas that dissident feminist struggle pursue as part of a feminist political vision remains largely invisible within ICF discourse, and its narrow conception of a feminist agenda in a conflict zone. However, these dissident feminists pose a powerful challenge to ICF in their call for interrogating how the systemic inequalities and hierarchies that are baked into the world system interact and intersect locally and globally in ways that absorb and include dominant feminisms. A challenging new feminist international is precisely what the Argentinian feminist Veronica Gago and the Spanish feminist Marta Marlowe speak about in their joint analysis of the global women's strike that has taken place annually since its inauguration on International Women's Day in March 8, 2017. The articulation of the spirit of this movement is one that lends horizontal solidarity to a range of radical demands in their interconnected logics, from debt to climate change, violence against women to structural racism. For instance, within Latin America, the movement was animated by a range of groups, including the reproductive rights movement in Argentina, the student movement against debt in Chile, the labor movement in Ecuador, the indigenous rights movement in Brazil, the Afro-Colombian rights movement in Colombia, but then build solidarities with social movements internationally, including those fighting authoritarianism in India and Turkey, agricultural workers in Morocco and Spain. Gago and Marlowe speak of the work that the strike does in taking space in public life, providing a shared political horizon as it convenes movements and assembles organizations. The range of feminist interventions I have briefly gestured to in the preceding pages varied in their interventions. Some aim to interrupt and refuse to cede horizons, others seek utopic reinvention of alternative horizons. Some, like the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, seek to do both, interrupting liberal internationalism's imperial ambitions, while also fighting for utopic feminist alternatives to the political horizon of Taliban rule. Rava's strategies and aims are both risky and ambitious, but perhaps they also offer an instructive ethos for feminist internationalism to recover an intellectually and politically radical space. This may involve less intimacy with the halls of power and more political risk, more interrogation of its own claims to political virtue, and less fortification of established assumptions, less caution about what constitutes a political agenda, and more ambition for what Gago calls a feminist international that will change everything.
Thank you. Lubavitch.
Thank you, Dr. Nesiah, for that beautiful talk, and to Dr. Miller for the opportunity to respond. And I also have to say thank you for writing this brilliant, highly recommended book, which I think is going to absolutely derail future critical scholarship on gender and conflict. And I say derail in the most loving, generative possible way. So I'm responding today not as a legal scholar, but as an anthropologist working on gender and conflict, which I think really speaks to the interdisciplinary reach of Dr. Nesiah's work and the extent to which it's able to travel. So I hope to just provide a few brief comments that can complement what's been put forward, draw out some of the major contributions, and give you a little time to formulate your Q&A questions. So as was mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here in the anthropology department and the international affairs program, and I'm teaching this year a third-year course in the international affairs program called Security, Culture, and Power. Shout out to Isabella, one of the students is here. And it's something of a cross between a primer on critical security studies and an exploration of the anthropology of security. And this year we're covering so many themes that are jumping off the pages of this book. Imperial feminism, counterinsurgency masquerading as humanitarianism, and the very poorly disguised, thinly veiled neocolonialism of the security development nexus. Next year, this book will have pride of place in the syllabus because it really achieves a unique degree of consolidation. By giving a name to ICF, this vast and unwieldy repertoire of agendas and strategies and vocabularies and policies where the principles of feminism feel so contorted that they're beyond recognition, she holds it still long enough for us to see it for what it is, right? For us to see it as part of this global governance regime. And this is especially critical because, as she notes, ICF presents itself as being, quote, beleaguered and marginalized, right? It presents itself as though it is struggling for recognition and for space, when really it's reigning triumphant, when really it has nearly every key to every room in the halls of power. But perhaps even more importantly than exposing the power of ICF, Dr. Nesiah's book reclaims space for the alternative anti-militarist feminisms that were eclipsed by ICF's rise. And in this way, it lays out a kind of cartography for a world that could have been, but wasn't. It's worth remembering that UNSCR 1325, right, this foundational document that would become or rattle into the Women's Peace Security Agenda, never actually calls for the increased participation of women in militaries. Yet it's evoked constantly as if it did, and as if this was actually its main purpose. So, question of how did we get there, right? So by telling the story of the uptake of ICF and the rise of ICF, while continuously insisting on carving out room for these alternative feminisms and dissident feminisms, she suggests that another world is still possible and that it already exists in partial form in some subaltern spaces. Another major contribution I'd like to draw out is one of the major signatures of ICF, which was discussed, which is its construction of gendered subjectivity that presents two possible subject positions for women in conflict, either as traumatized victims of war and usually victims of sexual violence, or as capable peacemakers who are agents of reconciliation and reconstruction, who are elbowing for room at these decision-making tables. And she writes that this gendered subjectivity has become common sense. So we're primed already to recognize women in conflict through the prism of these two subject positions. We're primed to see them this way wherever they are and whoever they are, regardless of any local context and any local considerations, because violence has become its own context. And in this way, ICF tells and retells this dangerously undifferentiated story of women in war in this universalizing vocabulary that is, to quote the book directly, unencumbered by the complexities of local context. And I've long been critical of how restrictive both of these roles are. On the women as peace builder side, I've critiqued how the exclusively positive or constructive understanding of women's agency, what I call agency as good, as if having agency only enables a person to do good deeds or serve as a force for good. And on the women as victim side, I've critiqued many things, the centrality afforded to sexual violence over other forms of violence in war, the implication that people become traumatized identically and necessarily as a result of exposure to violence, but most of all, the impossible and unattainable moral prerequisites of innocence and purity that are baked into the figure of the victim, which I take as a point of departure to explore how it's the case that not all violence seems to produce victims who are indeed legible to us as victims, right? As the over 40,000 Palestinians killed in the last year can attest, or the 1 million people killed in the United States' $8 trillion war on terror, and that number shoots to 4.7 million when indirect deaths are accounted for, can attest. And those stats are from the Cost of War project that Dr. Nesiah referenced. But this book does something even more interesting with the two possibilities of female subjectivity on offer, the victimized and the agentive. To quote again from the book, because it's beautifully written, these are important differences in emphasis that could spin out in different directions. However, the power of ICF is that both of its representations of gendered subjectivity can work in tandem, even if they are also in tension. The representation of the post-conflict woman as a mere victim opens the door to international interventions that shape and regulate women's lives, including economic policies that promise empowerment and individual self-regulation. She really draws out how these are two sides of the same coin, even though they appear opposing, and draws out this logic of governance that insists that women as victims are saved through military intervention, that they are the beneficiaries of counterinsurgency, and that women's interests and indeed women's rights are served by international intervention. And here again, we see women's rights discourses co-opted, or in Dr. Nesiah's language, conscripted, which I just love, to legitimize these military agendas. I'm almost at the end of my remarks here, but I want to close with one last contribution and one last provocation, really, which concerns the very notion of the conflict zone, as was discussed. Most of the courses I teach have a very strong conflict component and post-conflict components, because this is what I research, and so I fit it in everywhere. And I'm constantly asking my students to trouble the taken for granted delineation between conflict and post-conflict. I ask them to consider what is at stake in declaring a conflict to be over, that is, what forms of violence continue on but fail to be registered in the era deemed post-conflict. But I also ask them to consider what it means that the label of post-conflict gets applied for years, for decades, for generations, maybe eternally to certain places but not to others, and what formations of power operates in the ascription of this label. So how this label of post-conflict erodes sovereignty, turns countries into laboratories for marketization. In other words, who or what has the power to name and to keep naming a place as post-conflict, and what exactly is supposed to be achieved and to whose benefit for this label to be removed. But this book poses an even more fundamental provocation, nudging us to ask what all is contained in this crisis-laden label of the conflict zone itself. So she treats this zone not as an objective terrain, but as a discursive construction, as a signature of power. The conflict zone is in chaos, it cannot help itself, it requires, it even begs for a global governance. So in her analysis, the conflict zone is a new form of terra nullius, an invitation that the global north sends itself to intervene, to rescue, govern, and rule. But of course, not everywhere where there is suffering, only in the places where doing so will serve its interests. Thank you again, Dr. Nesiah, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. All right, thank you both. That was fantastic. Thank you for the response, thanks for the talk. And now, on to the Q&A. I ask you to recuse, as it were. Either a speaker or a respondent, so I think it's also open to questions. Yes, Ben.
Hi, Professor, thank you for your talk. I was kind of curious, hearing the talk and then also looking at the chapters that you assigned, to what extent you believe that ICF has become the consensus view in Western political space, or if it faces any prospective challenge from anti-feminist far-right movements that are growing in power in a lot of Western countries.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's so. Yes, I think it's probably facing critics from the right. The critics of the right is interesting because I think some of the critics of the right are internal to ICF, and some of the critics of the right are external. And that relationship, I think, in all sort of imperial feminisms is interesting always, because it's part of what shapes the sense of being besieged, always, of feeling always in crisis. But it's also, of course, part of what also gives it power, because it's also the right-wing discourse that says we know how to do women's rights right, unlike all of these other countries that are backward and uncivilized and whatever. So it is both. So I think arguably ICF itself is I don't know what left and right mean in all contexts, but it potentially could be described also as a particular kind of right-wing project that has gone mainstream. I don't know this. I just heard this term from a postdoc at NYU last week, so it's very new, but it seemed to be just precise. It seemed to capture something really important, and some of you may know this as well. She said there's this political theorist in France and it's a book that hasn't been translated into English yet, but who speaks of the extreme center. And I think the idea of the extreme center is basically captures a little bit what we sometimes talk about when we talk about the Clinton-Blair kind of mode, that there's a particular kind of Biden, there's a particular kind of right-wing politics that has now become center, that has become sort of extreme center. So I think of that, the right so to go to your question, I think the right that both lives within ICF as well as on its margins, pushing back against the particular kind, if any radical tendencies within ICF, if there were such, is that extreme center.
Since the Alassane case has now been decided, I was wondering, has that changed your view of the role that ICF has played in this case specifically? And, you know, the intersection between religion and gender persecution, because in the case, you know, some judges actually saw religion as a defense, or the reliance on religion. And then, you know, there was a judge who also found that there was religious persecution, but no gender persecution. Yeah, just now since this decision.
Right. Yeah. No, not so much, because I think my focus is about how the case came to be in the first place. So it is not so much about the. I think no. So I mean, actually, the interesting connection with the question about whether the right to push back against ICF, because I think, of course, the judges. It's a very. I mean, in all these courts, there's both this new kind of right wing, and there's also an old kind of right wing, and there's an old kind of right wing that you know that has its own patriarchal sort of commitments that flow through all of these things, and so that may be on the way out in some ways, but may also be, you know, so it's a, but I think what's more important is that the prosecutor brought the case in the first place, and you know, in many of these cases, how they end up is at least in the immediate may not tell us, may not be enough to tell us enough as a lens into the structure which they reflect. You know, maybe in if we see patterns after a while, maybe it'll tell us something. But so far, I feel that it's not indicative. And then religion versus, I mean, so they have in the same context of Timbuktu and Al-Sadin, there's been a series of cases of religious persecution, destruction of religious monuments, a whole range of sort of internal to Islam, and of course, yeah. That is also not surprising, because there were precedents in the same Mali situation where the ICC had ruled similarly, and yeah, I mean, I mentioned in the book there are other ways in which it's not as if like people like Hassan are warm and cuddly characters that we want to defend either. So, but it may well be that there are other things we may want to do with them, right? So, like I mentioned, for instance, is the film Timbuktu. I don't know whether anyone has seen it, but speaks, I think, very powerfully about the how local Islamic traditions in Timbuktu, and then the Islamic traditions that are brought by groups like Al-Sadin and brought from the outside very recently, partly as sort of the epiphenomenon, as you may say, of the Libyan and Mali intervention, and particularly actually Libya, that then moved people in different directions and expanded, groups, from Al-Qaeda to other groups, their own sense of what their geopolitical ambitions were. But anyway, they're all, in many ways, there's a lot of oppressions that local traditions of Islam in Timbuktu are fighting against. But it seems that so I give that film as an example because there are many ways in which to respond to how these things, and prosecution seem to be a particularly problematic way, because it's invested in all the kinds of things that I suggested, in all the different kinds of imperial agendas, and may also forces people to make choices that people may not want to make, because it is a script that is written with someone else's agenda behind it, and may not be actually captured in guilt or innocence.
I have a question for you, which is about future waves of, beyond second wave feminism. Where do they come into the ICF story, or do they?
Yeah, I think they don't come within the ICF story by and large. I think it is essential. I mean, well, they do come in particular ways, in the sense that sometimes, there are a lot of local groups. I mean, when the conflict zone, they suddenly, when I initially think it was a long time ago when I was realizing, in fact, the way in which it got consolidated. It was mostly from my own context. I'm from Sri Lanka originally. And if you look at how Sri Lanka figures in the international documents, initially it figures for this divergence between Sri Lanka being a very poor country, but having high socioeconomic indices on things like education and health and so on, because it is free healthcare and free education. So it's often you see it in those kinds of reports, in like, the human development reports and so on. But then, after the 80s, it emerges mostly in conflict zone. It's all about peace building, it's about conflict-related interventions, and now post-conflict policy. And you can see that shift in some sense, right? So there's a way in which all of these things are constantly interplayed in a range of different kinds of ways. But with feminist groups in Sri Lanka, so you could see also feminist groups and other groups, so all these alternative feminist traditions, that after a while you couldn't get funding unless you repackaged yourself into 1325. So there was, for many different reasons, including, I bring up the indices question partly because you had a very robust feminist community in Sri Lanka. They after a while couldn't get funding unless you framed your project in terms of 1325. And so even groups that were active on a whole range of things, on land issues, constitution issues, peace issues, war issues, on all of these things, after a while, and sometimes explicitly, like the EU, of course, explicitly had required that all funding applications be framed through the 1325 language. But I think it was implicitly within most donor community language as well. So there is a way in which those other feminisms do relate to ICF. Sometimes, in this, you do what you need to do for funding, and sometimes it changes you. Sometimes it is something that's it's the fundraising department and not your thing. But yeah, so I think there's a tension and potential conscription relationship there.
Hi. First, thank you for coming to speak with us and for sharing your work with us. I really liked the chapters that we had a chance to read. And something that I noticed was that you talked about the sort of like savage victim narrative and the way that our policy sort of like deploys that to bring in all of these interventions. But I was wondering why there isn't like much mention of sort of the flip side of the victimization of women, and that is that it's by having policy that is framed like that can create this sort of like perpetual like predator humanization sort of like air around men. And obviously this is like a piece of feminist work, so like should center perspectives about men. We don't need any more. We don't need much more work like that. But like I think it's important to sort of like mention because it is part of what makes it possible to sort of continuously do this policy. The idea that men, specifically Muslim men, are dangerous and that we need to stop them from harming women. So I'm curious what your opinions are on that, and I'm also interested, because selfishly I'm writing a paper about this topic. If you have any suggestions for sort of like examples that I should look at to get a better, get some more insights on this framing.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. So I think a couple of different things maybe. So I agree that the book doesn't engage with the. It engages only indirectly, like when I say like in the discourse around the Taliban, and so there's sort of there's an implicit discourse around Muslim men as always sources of danger, as from which you need to save Muslim women. But there's a way. So two different things. So one is this doesn't quite go to the gender politics of Muslim men and women, although there's some of that. But there's this. I think I mentioned I can't remember. Maybe in the chapter 4 itself. I think there is this sort of remarkable press briefing from the U.S. military, ones at the Defense Department, where there's a general from Afghanistan, American general who's serving in Afghanistan, who says the Taliban really doesn't know doesn't know what's Islamic. We are actually the real muhajirin. So there is a particular claiming of what, so there is the Muslim men thing, I mean, the psychodrama of that is also interesting. It's both, okay, these are the people we need to fight and they're the enemy, but there's also a sense of, I mean, it's not unlike, I think, I mean, that also, it feels like it resonates to me with a little bit with how race works in the US context as well. There's also that's real masculinity. There's some version of that, it's not, I don't think it's a dominant current, but off and on you see some version of that emerges. Then the other thing I want to say is that, of course, in the international criminal law, the first rape cases in the ICTY were cases where men were the victims. So there's also, I mean, that may also be interesting for you to unpack in relation to that, and thinking of the, how Muslim men get figured in the war in Yugoslavia, and are Muslim men victims most of that thing, and there's a lot of interesting work around what it means to, what that means. There's a fabulous book by Darrell Lee on Muslim, on sort of Muslim internationalism, amongst other things, but centered around Bosnia, that may be particularly interesting in terms of thinking about how we think about solidarity and men and solidarity in this particular context as well. It's not only men, but it's men are the main protagonists in that story. I think if there's anything else. I mean, again, I mean, I love this film, so I keep going back to the film. But in the film, it's the gender politics is also super interesting. They're also very, very strong women who are, idiosyncratic, but also very, very powerful. But the men in the film are also the men in the film are also very interesting. Have very it portrays alternative masculinities in ways that I think are not familiar from the outside, and not so from the local priest to a local like there's a main father guy in that who gets in one of those families. I mean, they're all men who are again, yeah, not, I would say, both men in different in ways that are unfamiliar to a typical to the typical depiction in cultural products. Yeah, let me stop there.
Anybody else need research papers? Well asked. Yeah.
Obviously, the responsibility to intervene, but it's inflicted a lot of harm. But when there are instances where women's rights are being violated, like, what do you think would be a better response, especially when it comes to concepts like, is there responsibility? Is that just always naturally projected to be used?
Right.
Or is there
Right. I mean, so I don't know what can be achieved, but should we engage? I think, yes, of course, but I think engaging in the name of solidarity is very different from engaging as an imperial presence in something. So I think, even in most contexts, I mean, it's difficult to think of a context where it would be useful for the US to militarily engage. In most contexts, I would think it's problematic for the US to militarily engage, but in almost all contexts, it is useful to engage solidaristically, and there are groups, like Women in Black is one example, for instance, of a group that's active everywhere from Palestine to Bosnia, that has been active in a whole range of different ways. But there are, so through solidarity, I mean, and today, I think is sort of a moment where you see a unprecedented, or not unprecedented, but unprecedented perhaps since Vietnam, a new moment of left internationalism in the world today, in a way that I think is, so this is why I say I don't know it achieves, what it has achieved a lot. It hasn't stopped killing, and it hasn't saved people's lives necessarily, or we don't know, but nevertheless, it's nevertheless powerful in itself, and it's so. I think those kinds of engagements are valuable. So that's why I ended partly on feminist internationalism, because I do think international solidarity is something that we should invest in. And but there is a Security Council resolution 1820 onwards, probably one of the sort of progeny of this 3025, that actually lays the ground for the possibility of military intervention as a peace and security issue. In other words, with chapter 7 powers of the Security Council, and they can intervene in when they think it's sexual violence. I think that's incredibly dangerous, and incredibly problematic. I can't. So there are certain kinds of interventions I would say are deeply problematic, but we should always engage, of course.
I have a connected question actually, which is, I think in the class over the course of the semester and talks and everything we've been hearing, right, there's always this struggle of kind of, we have this existing machinery, right, whether it's the carceral machinery, whether it's the military machinery, whether it's the UN, right, and, especially as we're thinking about what's unfolding in Gaza and Palestine and the Middle East, these questions of sort of like, arrest warrants at the ICC for Netanyahu and Gallant, or, going to the ICJ, whether it's South Africa, right? So I guess it's, the question of sort of how do you, not military intervention, but what about all these other formulations where we know how ensconced they are, right, in this problematic machinery? How should we, how do you think, right, as a person who's thinking in terms of solidarity, in terms of activism and advocacy, in terms of subordinated populations, sort of where we are, what do we do, right? Like, how do you think about that in your work?
Well, certainly with the international, so there's a turn to international courts in particular, and by people who are normally skeptical of courts. so turn to courts, including members of the third or left in some sense. But I think, it's a bit like the Al-Hassan case. I think one of our positions has to be how the court rules is not going to be, cannot be what we center. So it has to be about what's the way in which what happens outside the courtroom uses the court. So the courts, it's been a long standing inside of law and social movements, and the social movements should be law, not law should not be social movements, and that's true, I think, of the international as well. That what happens at the ICTJ, or at the ICJ, of course, but certainly what happens at the ICC or the ICJ should not be what frames what our goals are and what. So, there may be for most of my, for many years, I was always skeptical of the framing of genocide as a crime. I think in this particular case, I became convinced of it not because of the code so much, because I think in fact the legal definition is part of what's a problem with the category of genocide. But it has a resonance that completely exceeds its legal definition, and I think that is very helpful. And that's partly because of social movements that have nothing to do with what's happening. Well, it has not what to do, but certainly it has very little to do with its own legal trajectory. That it has much more to do with what indigenous communities have done in linking genocide to the dispossession of land. And I think that has resonance with the Palestine situation. And then that, I think, is a useful way to then actually open up the courts. So I think the courts can have a function, but a secondary kind of function. And I think they have a particular importance now in a way that they didn't have, say, 5 years ago. And I think it's important. Importance is not in The Hague, but the importance is the student encampments and the dock workers who are striking and not loading weapons to take to Israel and so on. I think they have reframed what's happening in the courts. So I think so to the extent that we engage with the courts, we have a responsibility to also constantly broaden people's vision of what the significance of the courts are.
Maybe that's in some ways the contrast between the kind of militarized and carceral feminism moves, right, that we've heard critiques of last week and this week, in the sense that was very much a power, like that was trying to get in the halls of power.
Right.
And your suggestion is basically use those halls but stay out of them.
Right. Yeah. And we have no that. We have
jump in, jump out.
Sure. You don't have the luxury of saying we can't.
Right.
So I mean, for those who haven't read Naura Arakat's Justice for Some, for Industry Narrates, the Palestinians' long engagement with international law. And it's not because they have any, Palestinian is naive about how hopeless law has been, but you can't afford to let it to not engage with that for as much. It's not because of faith, but in some critical and political and strategic way.
Do you think that military intervention in the name of ICF functionally works to set women's rights back further in the places that it targets, in a similar way to how economic imperialism works to leave nations worse off by replacing their economic policies with quasi-capitalist exploitative policies?
Right. I mean, to the extent that Afghanistan is sort of our example, certainly the one I think where, even if it was not what they initially said, but like they said, virtually 1 week into after the bombs started to fall, that it has made things difficult. Like, so in Afghanistan, what if women's groups in the US, instead of supporting the Galatin School, had instead sort of, deepened links with RAWA and groups like RAWA, which would have been an alternative. I think that would have had. So I mean, RAWA certainly. I mean, groups like RAWA certainly feel that they have been sent back. I mean, they were already fighting the Taliban, who are not that already they were in a tough situation. The Taliban was very ruthless, and then of course, fighting the biggest imperial power in the world. That's also so. Rather than having to fight on two fronts.
Can I ask a question about one of the chapters that was not right? One of the other ones?
Oh.
Is that okay? So I think it's chapter 5 about voices.
Truth Commission.
Yeah, specifically, translational justice and treatment. So I'm South African. Hence the interest, but also I worked a bit in translational justice, and I found it very interesting as you said that even though one would think of truth commissions as sort of juxtaposed to ICF, that the ICF narrative has influenced it.
Yeah.
And I think there was something about the truth that becomes audible is only the one that is in line with the ICF sort of narrative or agenda. And I know you didn't just look at South Africa, there were a couple of others. And just another one that comes to mind is the one in Gambia. They have a whole volume, I believe it's volume 10, that's on sexual and gender-based violence. I mean, that's of evidence. But what I found specifically interesting in this report is that one of their recommendations, beyond prosecution for it, was they recognized that the Gambia had an issue with sexual and gender-based violence in general beyond the Yamai era. So not just the previous administration, but a bigger issue. And that they had to build up organizations in the country to fix the problem, right? And they also speak to socioeconomic conditions and education. And I'm just wondering if there's a bit of a shift in the transitional justice framework. I'm hoping there is. That we are looking, that we're moving a little bit away from prosecution, ICF, framework, the Western framework of justice. I'm wondering if you've seen that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's struggles always, and I sort of think in general there tend to be more space for those struggles in truth commissions because it's still not it's not. I mean, on the one hand, I think what I'd say in that chapter is that from something that was really much more open-ended and much more experimental, it becomes much more professionalized and becomes much narrower. But nevertheless, it's still not it's not in the same space as the courts are. And therefore it still has a bit more space than this. So I didn't know, you know much more about the Gambian reports and the Gambian process than I do, so may well be. I think there are other places also where you can see perhaps parallel to the kinds of things that you were saying, where there are struggles to sort of broaden the effort of the report and often struggles internal to the report. I mean, of course, in South Africa, as you know, even the focus on having thematic hearings came out of struggles from local social movements pushing the court, pushing the commission to say we can't just do individual hearings. We need to have more, something that reflects the structural analysis of the preconditions for apartheid. And similarly, you have, in Sierra Leone, there was an argument which some of the commissioners were sympathetic to, saying you can't just look at what happened in the war, you need to look at women's land rights. You have to look at, and there was ways in which some parts of the report did try and do that. In Peru, again, the sexual violence chapters are sort of very orthodox and very much framed by a sort of international criminal law lens. But at the same time, in the hearings, there were others who were pushing for attention to other kinds of dimensions of the war that the Commission was not looking at, including persecution of lesbian and gay communities in Peru that came up sort of on the sides of the hearings. But the Commission was both one that was dominated, came out of there was a Catholic Church sort of imprint on it. So there are certain things like the LGBTQ issues, as well as the other issue was abortion, like forced pregnancy, because abortion was still illegal in Peru, that the Commission didn't fully engage with or didn't adequately engage with. But there were struggles around that, and you can see. I mean, you can read the footnotes to all of these Commission reports and see the story of those struggles. And that's, I think, whatever institution one is in, one has to push against its strictures. And I do think that commissions tell that story. I mean, there's a great example of that.
Questions? Well, I should also say, it could also be about genocide. There's a lot of things you guys are human. I happen to know, having known her for a few years. In addition to the chapters that you read, we did have a very lively discussion.
Yeah.
All settled into the end of the week.
So what do you guys think about international, so if I can then ask a question? Yes.
Anybody gets to ask a question.
What do you all think of international solidarity today? So taking off from the questions about, how do we engage? I mean, this is a time when everyone is, at least in Palestine, it's something that everyone has an opinion about.